10 in the morning, Sabattus Street, Lewiston, Maine. A woman steps outside a laundromat to take a phone call. Her 2 boys are right there beside her. 11 years old, twins. There's an old man inside the laundromat too. He's been pacing for the last few minutes. Inside, outside, inside again. He never takes his eyes off her, not once. And the second she sits down on those steps to talk on her phone, he reaches behind his back, where he'd been hiding the knife the whole time. Hey guys, welcome back. I want to be honest with you for a second before we get into this one, because this case sat with me for a long time, and not for the reason you'd expect. It's not the violence. It's that I kept counting how many people could have stopped this, and I kept getting to six different points where the system had this guy standing in front of them, knew exactly what he was, knew what he'd already done, and let him walk anyway. The last person who paid for that, her name was Kim Dobby. And before we go anywhere else, you need to know who she actually was. Kim Dobby was 48 years old, born in Rancourt, Massachusetts in 1969, quiet New England town, the kind of place people don't usually leave. She went to Bromfield School, then Lesley College in Cambridge, got her certificate in early childhood education, and then for about a decade, she taught little kids, Head Start program in Boston. And anyone who's worked Head Start knows what that takes. You're not just teaching ABCs. You're often the most stable adult in those kids' day, sometimes in their week. That was Kim. That was the work she chose to do for 10 years before she had her own kids. Twin boys, Cole and Dylan. Everyone who knew her tells you the same thing. Those boys were her whole world. Her uncle Robert Patterson described her as a free spirit, always smiling. A protector of her boys, right up until the end. Her friend Laura Kirkland put it differently. A perky redhead, even when she was frustrated. The most energy she'd ever seen in a single person. And here's a small thing about Kim that won't leave my head. She kept whole wheat crackers in her bag for the boys. Whole grains, real food. And one of her sons, for his birthday, asked for a textbook on World War II. Not a toy, a textbook. And Kim went looking everywhere until she found one. That's the kind of mom she was. Take that and hold on to it. You're going to need it later. Now, the reason Kim was in Maine in the first place, Massachusetts had gotten too expensive. She couldn't find affordable housing for herself and the boys. So in 2016, she moved to a small town called Farmington and started over. Then about 2 years later, she lost her teaching job, and things got hard fast. By the spring of 2018, Kim and the boys were homeless. They moved into a place called Hope Haven Gospel Mission, a shelter on Lincoln Street in Lewiston. Picture that for a second. A 48-year-old former teacher with 11-year-old twins, sleeping in a shelter, spending her days at the public library because that's where it's quiet and the boys can read. She wasn't there forever. She was waiting. She had a place lined up, an apartment in a town called Jay, about an hour away. She was packing, mentally, emotionally, days. She was days away from leaving. At the library, Kim made friends, real friends. Laura Kirkland, who was also at the shelter, Kathy Cormier, Lori Moreau, and Kim, being Kim, didn't just survive in that place. Her obituary literally says it. She befriended everyone she met. And one of the people Kim met at that library was a quiet old man who said hello. That's the part I want you to sit with. Because Kim wasn't naive. She wasn't reckless. She was an early childhood educator who had spent a decade reading people. She just looked at this small, hunched, hard-of-hearing old man and saw what almost anyone else would have seen. A harmless old guy. Okay, here's where I have to slow down. Because to understand who Kim was actually talking to that day, we have to go back nearly 40 years to another woman. Another small town in Maine, Westbrook, Maine, 1979. Sandra Flick was 35 years old. She had a 12-year-old daughter from her first marriage named Elsie. And Sandra had recently decided she was done with husband number 2, a man named Albert Flick. On January 10, 1979, Sandra had Albert served with divorce papers. And she did something a lot of women in that situation in the 70s did not do. She had the Westbrook police physically escort him out of their apartment. She knew what he was capable of. She wasn't taking chances. But here's the thing about divorce. There's stuff, his stuff, furniture, fishing gear, clothes, and someone has to come get it. For 3 weeks, Albert and Sandra fought about custody of their 2 young boys. She called the police on him more than once. Then on the morning of January 31st, 1979, Albert drove to Westbrook to pick up his belongings. And here's the detail from the court file that has stayed with me. He had a gun and a knife in the car. He parked 3/4 of a mile from the apartment, and he took only the knife. That's not a man losing control. That's a man making choices. He walked up, knocked, came inside, and Elsie, Sandra's 12-year-old, slipped into the back bedroom and stayed there. Albert asked Sandra about some fishing poles. He wanted her to bring them out so he could show her how to remove the hooks from the line. This is the moment I need you to actually hear, because Elsie was watching the whole thing through a crack in the bedroom door, 12 years old, watching her mom bend over a fishing pole to reach for the hook. And she watched Albert grab Sandra's arm, bend it behind her back, cover her mouth with his other hand, and tell her he loved her, that he didn't want to hurt her. Sandra screamed. Elsie ran down the stairs, pounding on a neighbor's door, trying to get someone to help. The neighbor ran upstairs and saw Albert Flick on the way down, covered in blood. Sandra was inside. She'd been stabbed multiple times, her chest, her neck, once through the heart, but she was still alive, just barely. And she held on long enough to do one last thing for her daughter. She told the neighbor who had done this. She said her husband's name, and then she died. Albert Flick was 36 years old at the time. He'd worked at the same donut shop in Westbrook for 19 years. Army veteran, discharged on a hardship, by every external measure, the kind of guy you would not look at twice. Quiet, worked his job, showed up every day. The judge at his trial was Justice Harry P. Glassman. And in his sentencing remarks, Glassman said something I think about a lot. He called it a particularly brutal killing. He said the pressures Albert faced were the same pressures other people go through in a divorce without resorting to violence. And then Glassman gave him 30 years. Hold that thought for me. 30 years. For the murder of a wife in front of her child. We'll come back to that number, because it matters more than you think. Now, I want to bring you back to the man inside that laundromat in 2018. Because here's the part nobody has been able to explain in any reasonable way. 2 days before Kim Dobby died, Albert Flick walked into the Walmart on the edge of Lewiston. Camera caught the whole thing. He didn't sneak around. He didn't look over his shoulder. He just shopped. And he picked up 2 pink-handled paring knives. 5-inch blades, $2.24 each. 2 of them. He bought 2. And I want you to actually sit with that for a second. Because in any other context, that's a man buying knives for his kitchen. $2 paring knives. Pink handles. The cheapest thing in the aisle. But this was a 76-year-old man already convicted of stabbing his wife to death 39 years earlier. With a knife. Quietly buying 2 more. And nobody knew. Not Kim. Not her friends at the shelter. Not the cashier ringing him up. Because as far as the entire community of Lewiston was concerned, Albert Flick was just an old man. And here's what I genuinely cannot get past. Almost 40 years before that day at Walmart, this same man drove to his ex-wife's apartment with a gun and a knife and parked 3/4 of a mile away to make sure no one saw him. He took only the knife. He used a fishing pole story to get her into position. He told her he loved her right before he killed her. That was 1979. In 2018, the same man was buying 2 paring knives for less than $5 total, driving home, putting them somewhere, waiting 2 days, same playbook, same kind of woman, same kind of weapon, just an older man holding the knife. And the whole reason he was free to do any of this comes down to one sentence that one judge said in a courtroom in 2010, a sentence that, if you'd read it out loud to anyone in Kim's life, they would have stopped you midway through and said, "Wait, hold on, that's insane." But the people who needed to stop that judge were sitting right there in the courtroom that day, and they did try, 2 of them by name, and he ignored both of them. That's where we're going next. Okay, to get to 2010, we have to walk through what Albert Flick did between leaving prison the first time and walking into that courtroom, because the system had a lot of chances, and I mean a lot. He served 21 years of that 30-year sentence and got out in October 2000 for good behavior. So 9 years off the top, just for not causing trouble inside. Think about that for a second. A man who killed his wife in front of her child got 9 years cut off because he behaved in prison. The bar for early release on a murder sentence in Maine in 2000 was apparently don't fight anyone in the cafeteria. He moved to Portland, got an apartment on Bramhall Street, and in June 2007, he was arrested for assaulting a girlfriend, punched her, stabbed her with a fork, then tried to intimidate her so she wouldn't testify against him. He pleaded down, served a few months. Then in 2010, he did it again. Different woman. Argument in his apartment on Brackett Street. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, put her in a headlock, and started hitting her with the butt end of the handle. She managed to knock the knife from his hand and run. Flick went looking for another weapon. He yelled after her, "If that doesn't work, I know what will." Then he picked up a screwdriver and chased her down. She got away, called police. And when officers arrived at the building, they found Albert Flick on a fire escape trying to hang himself. Read that again. This is the man Maine then put back in front of a judge. And the prosecutor on this case was Katherine Tierney. And she came in that day asking for serious time, not for one charge, for both. 3 years and 11 months for violating his probation from the 2007 assault, plus another 4 to 5 years on the new charges. Roughly 9 years total. Her words to the judge that day are still on the record. Probation isn't working. There's a huge safety risk to women in society when it comes to Mr. Flick. And then his probation officer, Troy Thornton, stood up, and Thornton said the quiet part out loud. He's an extremely violent individual when it comes to relationships. He hasn't slowed down. I don't see him slowing down. And then Thornton asked the judge for something unusual. He asked that any future relationship Flick entered into had to be reported to the probation department. Probation officers do not normally request that. It's not a standard condition. Thornton was waving a flag. He was telling the court, this man is a relationship killer. We need to know who's near him. The judge in that courtroom was Maine Superior Court Justice Robert E. Crowley. And here is exactly what Crowley said. At some point, Mr. Flick is going to age out of his capacity to engage in this conduct, and incarcerating him beyond the time that he ages out doesn't seem to me to make good sense from a criminological or fiscal perspective. Read that one more time. From a fiscal perspective, he talked about cost. A man with a murder conviction. A man who'd already attacked 2 more women after getting out. A man whose own probation officer said he was a relationship killer, and the judge said it cost too much to keep him. Crowley sentenced him to just under 4 years, half of what the prosecutor asked for. He noted Flick would be 72 or 73 when released, as if that age, by itself, was a kind of insurance policy. Here's what most people don't know. Crowley retired from the bench that same year, 2010. The same year, he handed down that sentence. And on his way out, he was widely praised. By attorneys, by other judges, even by the father of another convicted killer, who wrote him a thank you letter for treating his family with dignity. That's the moment we're talking about. The judge who let Flick walk was leaving the bench in good standing. Flick got out in 2014, and almost immediately, he ran into the same woman he'd attacked back in 2010 on Congress Street in Portland. He stared her down, got in her face, and said, "You'll get yours." She flagged down a cop. He went back to prison. Got out again on January 28, 2016. 73 years old now. He moved to Lewiston, moved in with his nephew, started showing up at the public library. And that brings us back to the part of the story that gets harder every time I read it. Because Albert Flick met Kim Dobby at that library. And he didn't just notice her, he shadowed her. Witnesses at trial described what it actually looked like. Kim and the boys would walk to the bus stop. Flick would appear at the bus stop. Kim would take the boys to Dunkin' for breakfast. Flick would be at Dunkin'. She'd be looking for a book in the children's section. He'd be winding around the shelves a few feet behind. Hunched, hard of hearing, quiet. He even started showing up at Hope Haven, where she was staying with her sons. He'd come for meals. He told one of Kim's friends that he saw her once and was, quote, blown away by her beauty. He started offering to buy nutritious food for her boys. Friends said he followed her around like a lost puppy. Eventually, Kim told him to leave her alone. Her friend Lori Moreau said she saw the bad in him from day one. But Kim was too kind, too polite. She kept tolerating his presence even after she'd asked him to back off. And then a friend named Nina Parent told reporters something that has never left me. She said Flick kept saying that if it weren't for her 2 boys, things could be different between them. He kept trying to pursue something with her. Police said he wasn't a romantic partner. He had no claim on her. He was a man fixated on a woman who'd shown him basic kindness at a library. And Kim was about to leave town. The apartment was ready. She was going to take the boys and move to that apartment in J. He was not invited. The prosecutor at trial would later put it in one sentence. The obsession became, if I can't have her, I will kill her. And that exact thought is the only thing that explains what he did next. Because 2 days before Kim died, he went to that Walmart and bought those 2 paring knives, and then he went home and waited. Sunday morning, July 15th, 2018, Kim left Hope Haven with Cole and Dylan. They walked to a Dunkin' on Main Street, got their breakfast, and from somewhere behind them, Albert Flick was walking too. He followed them across town to Rancourt's coin-operated laundromat on Sabattus Street. The boys went outside to play on the sidewalk. Kim put a load of laundry in. Then she stepped outside, sat down on the steps, and called someone on her phone. And inside the laundromat, security cameras picked up Albert Flick, pacing up and down, inside, then outside, then inside again, always keeping Kim in his line of sight, like he was waiting for the exact right moment. The prosecutor described the camera footage at trial like this. Flick reaches behind to the small of his back, takes out the knife, stands in front of Kim, raises his arm, 11 times, at least, maybe more. One wound cut the left ventricle of her heart. Another fractured a rib and pierced her right lung. The medical examiner testified that Kim Dobby died from blood loss. And here is the part that the judge would later focus on at sentencing. Cole and Dylan were right there. They saw their mother stabbed. They started running toward her. And on the camera, you can see Albert Flick looking up at the boys, right at them, and then continuing. He saw their faces. He knew exactly what they were watching. And he kept going. I genuinely needed to take a break the first time I read that line in the court record, because that is not a man who lost control. That is something else entirely. And then a man named Dennis Fisher saved what was left of the moment. Fisher was from New Hampshire. He was in Lewiston on business. He just opened a dryer at the laundromat when he heard Kim screaming. Real loud. He testified to that, just screaming for help. He ran outside. He saw Flick standing over Kim, and Dennis Fisher did not hesitate. He drop-kicked a 76-year-old man to the ground. The knife flew through the air, and Fisher pinned Flick's neck to the sidewalk with his foot until police arrived. Another bystander, Eric Drake, ran to Kim. He held her. He called 911. He tried to put pressure on the wounds. He said later she had a terrified look on her face. She was bleeding everywhere. Both of these men cried on the witness stand at trial. Dennis Fisher wiped tears from his face, describing it. Strangers. Two strangers, who happened to be at a Lewiston laundromat that morning. And they did more for Kim Dobby in the last few minutes of her life than the state of Maine had done in the previous 26 years. Kim was rushed to Central Maine Medical Center. She died there a short time later. Her boys went into police custody until family could come up from Massachusetts. Flick was taken to the same hospital, complaining of chest pains. Then he was arrested. The next day, friends of Kim's gathered on that exact sidewalk for a candlelight vigil. Her friend, Kathy Cormier, the one who'd told her to tell Flick to back off, said one thing to the press that night. Her smile will be eternal. A big, bright spot in all of our lives. She is not a woman who will be forgotten. They brought a memorial to the vigil, made by Kim, from folded art paper and potato chip bags, something she'd been crafting with her boys at the shelter. That's what they brought to the place where she died. And here is the question that haunted that vigil, because everyone there had figured out by then who Albert Flick was. Nina Parent said it on camera. Police need to take it seriously when women say they fear for their life. A simple background check could have saved her life. Because the state of Maine has a domestic violence risk assessment, it's been law since 2014. 13 questions. Police are required to administer it in domestic violence cases. But Kim never reported Flick, and so the system never had a chance to add her name to anything. The Lewiston police chief, Brian O'Malley, told the New York Times she didn't come to us. I wish she had. Her friends say she did mention something to an officer once. There's no record of that conversation. And in any case, even if she had filed a formal complaint, Maine doesn't have a public domestic violence offender registry. Other states do. Maine doesn't. So even if Kim had walked into the Lewiston police station the day before she died and said, "This old man is following me from the library to the bus stop to my shelter. His name is Albert Flick," there is no public database she could have been pointed to. There's no way she could have looked him up herself. The 30-year-old murder of Sandra Flick was technically public record, but you'd have had to know to go looking. You'd have had to type that exact name into the right system. Kim had no reason to know that name. And that brings us finally to a courtroom in Auburn, Maine, almost a year after Kim died, August 9th, 2019. Albert Flick is sitting at the defense table in a blue prison-issue uniform, wearing headphones to hear the proceedings. A jury had already convicted him of murder. 40 minutes of deliberation. They didn't even need to break for lunch. The judge presiding over sentencing was a woman named Mary Gay Kennedy, and what she did that day matters. Kennedy looked at Flick. She listed what she'd weighed in deciding the sentence. The premeditation, the savagery of the attack, his prior convictions, and then she said something that I think the entire state of Maine should have heard. "Mr. Flick, You have not taken responsibility. You have shown no remorse." And then she described what those 11-year-old boys had actually witnessed. Their mother knew she was going to die. She knew she was going to die in front of her boys. The defense lawyer asked for 25 years. He cited Flick's declining health. He said Flick had grown up in a large family with an abusive father. Kennedy was not moved. She handed down a life sentence, and she explained why on the record. "What is almost incomprehensible," she said, "is that Mr. Flick has done this before." Then she asked him directly, "Mr. Flick, would you like to say anything to the court, to Kim's family, to her 2 sons, to the courtroom?" Albert Flick shook his head, and he said one word, "Nah." That was it. That was the only thing he had to say after taking 2 women's lives across 40 years. One syllable, to Kim's mother sitting in the courtroom, to Cole and Dylan, who were not there, but who would read about that moment for the rest of their lives. Nah. And here's what most videos about this case don't tell you. The judge who started this, Robert Crowley, he was fine. He retired from the bench in 2010 in good standing, praised by colleagues. He went to work as a mediator at a law firm in Portland, Maine. After Kim was killed, reporters tried to get him on the phone. He didn't return their calls. He never made a public statement about Flick. He never apologized to Kim's family. He's still out there, still mediating disputes. The man whose one decision freed Albert Flick was never personally accountable to anyone for what came next. And I want to be careful here, because Crowley wasn't entirely wrong about the data. He was citing real research. People over 65 do recidivate at much lower rates than younger offenders, across all crimes. That part of his statement was true. But Crowley wasn't being asked to sentence a category. He was being asked to sentence a man whose own prosecutor said had a, quote, huge safety risk to women, a man whose probation officer said was a relationship killer, a man who had just attempted to hang himself from a fire escape after attacking a woman with a knife and a screwdriver. The data was a category. Albert Flick was an outlier, and outliers are the entire point of having human judgment in a courtroom. Okay, I want to take a step back here, because if you've been listening to all of this and thinking surely some other country handles this differently, you're right, they do. Let me give you 3 quick examples. Australia, 2012. A young Irish-Australian journalist named Jill Meagher was walking home from a bar in Melbourne. A man named Adrian Bailey raped and killed her. Bailey was 41. He had 16 prior convictions for sexual assault. He was on parole when he attacked Jill. The parole board had ignored his pattern. After the conviction, 30,000 people marched down Sydney Road in Melbourne for Jill. By the following June, Victoria's parole laws were rewritten. Violent offenders who breach parole now go straight back to prison. Automatic. Bailey got life with 35 years before parole eligibility, later increased to 43. The Australian system did not solve the underlying problem, but it did look at itself in the mirror. It did change. England, 2023. A woman named Alana Otaseos, 32 years old, mother of 2, pregnant with her 3rd child, killed by a man named Shane March. March had killed before, stabbed a teenager when he was 21, got out, was sent back for stamping on the stomach of another pregnant girlfriend, got out again, and killed Alana. Her family wasn't told about any of it. March's first sentence after Alana's death was light. Alana's sister Jasmine collected 38,000 signatures. The Solicitor General sent it to the Court of Appeal. The original sentence was thrown out. He got a whole life order. Jasmine is now campaigning for something she calls Alana's Law, a mandatory domestic violence offender register for high-risk offenders. The point is, when families get loud, the British system can move. California, 2021. A man named Darrell Collins killed his girlfriend Fatima Johnson, mother of 6 children, in her own apartment. He'd been released 364 days earlier, released early under a youthful offender provision. From 2 prior murder convictions from 1995, he served 25 years on a 50-year sentence, got out, killed Fatima inside 1 year. The Los Angeles District Attorney went on TV. He named the law that let Collins out. He said exactly what had happened, on the record. The legislature is now reviewing that statute. So 3 other systems, 3 other women, 3 different decades, 3 governments that at minimum had to look at the problem. Now here's the question. Who marched for Kim Dobby? In Lewiston, Maine. The candlelight vigil happened. Friends came. The community grieved for a few days. The trial happened a year later. Local papers covered the verdict. And then it just kind of ended. There is no Kim's Law in Maine. There is still no public domestic violence offender registry in the state of Maine more than 7 years after Kim died. The 13-question risk assessment is still on the books, but it only triggers when a victim files a report. Kim never filed. Most women like Kim don't. The system is designed for the moment after harm, not for the moment when an old man is standing 2 feet too close at a library. And here's where I have to come back to that number from the very beginning. 6. 6 points where the system had Albert Flick in front of it. 1979 Justice Glassman gives him 30 years for murdering Sandra in front of her child. He served 21. 2000 parole board lets him out for good behavior with no public registry attached. 2007 he stabs a girlfriend with a fork, pleads down, serves a few months. 2010 Crowley, the big one. 2 professionals begging him on the record to keep Flick locked up. He doesn't. 2014 Flick threatens his last victim, gets sent back, but only for the probation violation. 2016 released for the final time. 2018 Kim, 6 places, 6 chances. And in each one, somebody chose efficiency or budget or the quiet hope that age would do the work the system was supposed to do, until eventually nobody chose for Kim at all. Roughly half of the murders in Maine are connected to domestic violence. Half. That's not a fluke. That's a category. And in case after case, the warning signs were there, just like they were with Albert Flick. The pattern is the system, not the man. I want to come back to something I told you to hold on to, near the beginning. The whole wheat crackers, the textbook on World War II, the kind of mom Kim was, because here's where that detail finally pays off in a way I didn't see coming. Cole and Dylan are alive. They live in Massachusetts now, with Kim's mother, Sue, who is in her 70s and raising her 2 grandsons mostly alone. Kim's brother moved back from Baltimore to help. Kim's uncle, Robert Patterson, visits. The boys go to school. They're in therapy. They went to Martha's Vineyard for a weekend after the trial. They got to be on a beach for a few days. They came home. They keep going. There's a fund in their name at a credit union in Massachusetts. The Dobby Children Benevolent Fund. People still send to it. And here's the part. 40 years before those boys watched their mother die on a sidewalk in Lewiston, a 12-year-old girl named Elsie watched her own mother die in Westbrook. The same man held the knife in both rooms, the same hand, 40 years apart. Elsie is in her 50s now. She gave interviews after Kim's killing. She said she still cannot understand how Albert Flick was on the streets at all. She said she would like to stand the people who let him out in a line and ask them, one by one, to explain to Kim's 2 sons what law it was, what age, what budget calculation, what administrative reason made it acceptable for those boys to watch their mother be killed by the same man who killed her own. And so far, no one has answered her. No judge, no parole board, no state legislator, no one. Kim Dobby was a Head Start teacher. She kept whole wheat crackers in her bag for her sons. Her favorite season was Christmas. Her favorite place was the beach. She befriended everyone she met. That last sentence is on her gravestone, basically. And the last person she ever befriended was a small, hunched, hard-of-hearing old man at a public library who said hello to her, because that's the kind of person Kim Dobby was. She made room for the lonely man at the edge of the room. Right up until the moment she died, she was still being who she'd always been. That part is on Albert Flick. The system is on the rest of us. Her name was Kim Dobby. She was 48 years old, and she's the reason I started counting to 6